The year was 1879. The Arizona Territory was a lawless frontier, where gold fever drove men to madness, and survival meant kill or be killed. What happened in the Dragoon Mountains that bloody summer would become one of the most horrific and controversial stories in American frontier history. This isn't just another tale of frontier violence. It's the story of the Vega family, caught between two worlds, who unleashed a vengeance so brutal it would haunt the desert for generations. Picture this: 16 prospectors, their bodies found skinned alive, staked to the desert floor under the merciless Arizona sun. The authorities called it savagery. The Apache called it justice. But the truth is far more complex than anyone dared to imagine. You're about to discover a story that textbooks won't tell you. A story of betrayal, survival, and revenge that challenges everything you think you know about the American West. So buckle up, because what you're about to hear will change how you see frontier justice forever. The Vega family, caught between worlds, meet Joaquin Vega, a man who lived in the shadows between civilizations. Born to a Mexican father and an Apache mother in 1845, Joaquin embodied the complex cultural tensions that defined the borderlands. His wife Alina was pure Apache, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her fierce loyalty to family. Together, they had 3 children: Miguel, 19, already skilled with both rifle and knife; Sophia, 16, whose intelligence far exceeded what frontier society expected from a young woman; and little Carlos, just 12, but already wise beyond his years in the ways of the desert. The Vega family wasn't your typical frontier settlers. They lived on a small ranch in the Dragoon Mountains, surviving by trading horses, hunting, and occasionally guiding travelers through the treacherous desert passes. Joaquin spoke perfect English, Spanish, and Apache, making him invaluable to anyone needing to navigate the cultural minefield of territorial Arizona, but their mixed heritage made them targets from all sides. Mexican authorities viewed them with suspicion because of Elena's Apache blood. Apache tribes sometimes saw Joaquin as a sellout for cooperating with whites and white settlers, while they saw the entire family as potential threats, too Indian to trust, too Mexican to accept, too successful to ignore. The family's ranch sat strategically at the mouth of Cochise Canyon, controlling access to some of the richest gold deposits in southern Arizona. This wasn't coincidence. Joaquin had chosen the location carefully. Understanding the control of the pass meant control of their destiny. What he couldn't have predicted was how that control would paint a target on their backs. Alina had grown up hearing stories from her grandmother about the old ways, when Apache justice was swift and absolute. She'd learned to read the desert like a book, to track men across impossible terrain, and to survive where others would die of thirst in hours. These weren't just survival skills, they were weapons waiting to be unleashed. The children had inherited the best of both worlds. Miguel could shoot like his father and track like his mother. Sophia spoke 4 languages and could navigate both Apache tribal politics and territorial business dealings. Young Carlos possessed an almost supernatural ability to move through the desert unseen, earning him the Apache nickname Ghostwalker. This was the family that 16 white prospectors decided to cross. In the summer of 1879, they had no idea they were about to awaken a sleeping wolf. If you're already hooked by this incredible story, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because this tale is just getting started, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The gold rush fever of the Arizona Territory in the 1870s was pure chaos, wrapped in the promise of instant wealth. News of gold strikes traveled faster than wildfire, drawing desperate men from across the country. These weren't just adventurers. They were broken Civil War veterans, failed farmers, escaped criminals, and dreamers who'd lost everything back east. The desert didn't care about their past. It only cared about their ability to survive. The Bradshaw Mountains had already yielded fortunes. Wickenburg was booming. Tombstone was about to explode onto the scene. But experienced prospectors knew the real treasures lay hidden in the remote canyons and forgotten corners where Apache resistance had kept white men away for decades. That's where our story's antagonists come in. A group of 16 prospectors led by a man named William Bull Morrison. Morrison was everything wrong with the frontier gold rush, rolled into one violent package. A former Confederate cavalry officer who'd never accepted defeat. He viewed the Arizona Territory as his chance to rebuild the fortune and respect he'd lost in the war. Morrison's crew wasn't just looking for gold. They were running from something. Half of them had warrants back east. The other half had burned bridges they could never rebuild. They'd heard rumors about rich deposits in the Dragoon Mountains, protected only by a few mixed-blood families and scattered Apache bands. The group included characters you'd find in your worst nightmares. Preacher Collins, a defrocked minister who quoted scripture while planning violence. The Harwick brothers, twins who developed a reputation for brutality even by frontier standards. Jake Williamson, a former buffalo hunter who bragged about taking Apache scalps. And Tom Bradley, whose hatred for anyone non-white had become legendary across 3 territories. These men brought more than mining equipment into the Dragoons. They brought violence as a way of life, racial hatred as a guiding principle, and the kind of frontier arrogance that viewed other people's land as theirs for the taking. Morrison's plan was simple: establish mining claims throughout the Dragoon Mountains, regardless of who currently lived there. If locals cooperated, they might be allowed to stay as laborers. If they resisted, well, the desert was full of unmarked graves already. The prospectors had done their homework. Sort of. They knew about Joaquin Vega's ranch controlling the main. Past they'd heard he was half-breed friendly, and figured they could either buy him off or run him off without much trouble. What they didn't know was that the Vega family wasn't just another frontier household trying to scratch out a living. They didn't know about Elena's connections to Geronimo's band. They didn't know about Joaquin's reputation among Mexican revolutionaries. They didn't know that the family had spent years building relationships with every outlaw, Apache warrior, and desert survivor within 100 miles. Most importantly, they didn't know that respect in the desert wasn't earned through intimidation. It was earned through blood. And the Vega family had earned more respect than Morrison's crew could imagine. The stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine frontier justice and create legends that still whisper through the desert wind today. The first encounter: respect meets arrogance. May 15, 1879. The desert sun was already merciless at 10 in the morning when Morrison's group approached the Vega ranch. Dust devils danced across the valley floor like spirits, warning of coming violence. Joaquin was working with horses in the corral when he spotted the approaching riders, 16 men, heavily armed, riding with the confidence of people who'd never been told no by anyone they couldn't kill. Elena emerged from the house, her hand resting casually on the knife at her belt. Miguel appeared from the barn, his rifle held low, but ready. Sophia continued hanging laundry, as if nothing was happening. But her positioning gave her clear shots to 3 different pieces of cover. Even young Carlos seemed to vanish into the landscape, visible one moment and gone the next. Morrison rode up to the fence and didn't dismount. A deliberate insult in a culture where respect began with how you approached another man's home. You, Joaquin Vega? Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. I am. What brings you to my land? Morrison smiled without warmth. Your land. That's interesting. Way I understand it. This here's territorial land, open for filing claims. We're here to let you know we'll be working the mountains behind you. Thought you should know, being neighborly and all. Joaquin studied the 16 faces staring down at him. He'd seen their type before. Men who mistook violence for strength, intimidation for leadership. The mountains belong to the Apache. They have treaties with the government. You'll need their permission, not mine. Apache treaties. Preacher. Collins laughed harshly. Those savages got no rights to treaty with anyone. They're getting moved to reservations where they belong. Elena stepped forward, her English perfect despite her accent. My people have lived in these mountains for 1,000 years. Papers from Washington don't change that. Jake Williamson spat into the dust. Your people. Lady, you need to remember what you are and where you stand. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees, despite the blazing sun. Miguel's grip tightened on his rifle. Sophia stopped pretending to hang laundry. Even the horses seemed to sense the sudden shift toward violence. Joaquin raised his hand slightly, a signal his family understood. Not yet, gentlemen. Voice remained calm. But those who knew him would have recognized the dangerous undertone. You're welcome to try filing claims in the mountains. But understand this, those mountains are protected by more than Apache treaties. They're protected by Apache warriors. And those warriors have friends. Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. You threatening us? Breed. I'm educating you. There's a difference. The silence stretched like a bowstring. Finally, Morrison straightened up. Well, we appreciate the education. Here's some education for you. We're taking those mountains, whether the Apache like it or not. Whether you like it or not. Way I see it, you got 2 choices. You can help us, and we'll cut you in for a piece. Or you can get in our way, and we'll go through you. Joaquin looked each man in the eye, memorizing faces, cataloging weapons, assessing threats. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. There's a third choice you haven't considered. What's that? You can leave now. Today, before you do something that can't be undone. Morrison's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. Mister, I don't think you understand who you're talking to. We ain't the leaving kind. As the prospectors rode away, toward the mountains, Elena moved beside her husband. They'll be back, she said in Apache. I know. And when they come back, it won't be to talk. I know that too. That evening, Carlos returned from his scouting with news that chilled even these desert-hardened survivors. The prospectors hadn't just made camp in the mountains. They'd built it on a sacred Apache burial ground. They'd torn down medicine wheels to clear space for their equipment. They'd fouled a sacred spring with their mining operations. The boy had something else to report. Something that made Elena's eyes go dark with fury. Mama, I saw them burning things. Apache things. Sacred things. They were laughing. Joaquin closed his eyes. He'd tried to give them a chance. He'd tried to warn them. Now it was too late for warnings. That night, smoke signals began appearing on distant peaks. By morning, Apache war drums were echoing through canyons that hadn't heard them in years. The mountains themselves seemed to be waking up, angry and hungry for justice. The prospectors had made their choice. Now they would live with the consequences, or die with them. This story is about to take a turn that will shock you to your core. Don't forget to hit that like button, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever heard of frontier justice this brutal? Because what happens next will redefine everything you think you know about survival in the American West. Sacred ground defiled what Morrison's crew didn't understand. What they couldn't understand was that their decision to camp on Apache sacred ground wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war against the spirit world itself. The burial ground they'd chosen sat atop a mesa overlooking 3 river valleys. A place where Apache ancestors had been laid to rest for over 500 years. The site wasn't just sacred, it was protected by ceremonies, prayers, and spiritual forces that most white men dismissed as superstition. The Apache knew better. Elena's grandmother had been buried there just 2 years earlier. The old woman had been a medicine woman, a keeper of the old ways, and someone whose death had been mourned by Apache bands across the entire Southwest. Her burial site was marked by a circle of stones arranged in patterns that told the story of her life, her visions, and her promises to protect the people even after death. Morrison's crew had used those sacred stones to build a fire pit. When Carlos brought this news back to the ranch, Elena didn't speak for 3 hours. She sat on the porch, staring toward the mountains, her hands working automatically at beadwork, while her mind traveled to places where white men's laws held no power. Joaquin understood his wife well enough to recognize the stillness that preceded a hurricane. Elena wasn't just angry, she was connecting with something primal, something that existed before treaties and territorial governments and mining claims. She was becoming the granddaughter of warriors who had defended these lands. When Coronado first arrived, Miguel found his mother that evening, sitting beside the old shrine his Apache grandmother had built behind the house. Mama Elena looked up, and Miguel saw something in her eyes that made him step backward. His mother was still there, but something else was there too, something that belonged to the desert night and the hunting wind. They burned your great-grandmother's medicine bundle, she said quietly. Miguel felt the blood drain from his face. Medicine bundles weren't just personal possessions, they were living connections to the spirit world, passed down through generations, containing powers that protected entire families. They didn't know, they knew. Elena's voice carried absolute certainty. Williamson has Apache scalps on his belt. He knows what sacred things look like. They burned it deliberately. That night, Elena disappeared into the desert. She returned before dawn, her face painted with traditional war paint, her hair braided with hawk feathers, her grandmother's war knife hanging from her belt. When Joaquin saw her, he knew their world had changed forever. The spirits have spoken, she announced. To her family, they demand blood payment for the desecration. Sophia looked up from cleaning her rifle. How much blood, Mama? All of it. This wasn't about territory anymore. It wasn't about gold or mining rights or frontier politics. This was about spiritual warfare, about ancestors demanding vengeance, about forces that existed long before white men arrived and would exist long after they were gone. Joaquin faced an impossible choice. He could try to calm the situation, maybe arrange some kind of compensation, attempt to restore peace through negotiation, or he could support his wife's call for traditional Apache justice. The choice became easier when Carlos returned from another scouting mission with news that made even Joaquin's blood run cold. "Papa, they're not just mining, they're digging up graves. They found some old burial sites, and they're taking things. Bones and jewelry, and ... The boy couldn't finish. Grave robbing wasn't just crime, it was an assault on the fundamental order of the universe. The Apache believed that disturbing the dead brought curses that could destroy entire bloodlines. But more than that, it was an act of such profound disrespect that it demanded the most extreme response their culture could provide. Alina began singing that night. Not the gentle lullabies she'd sung to her children, but war songs her grandmother had taught her, songs that called on ancient powers to ride with warriors into battle. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like voices from another world. By the third night, those voices were being answered. Smoke signals appeared on distant peaks. Apache riders began moving through canyons that white men didn't even know existed. The desert itself seemed to be mobilizing for war. Morrison's crew, busy with their mining and their grave robbing, noticed none of this. They were too focused on the growing pile of gold dust and the artifacts they planned to sell to collectors. Back east, they'd found a particularly rich site, a burial chamber that contained not just jewelry but actual Spanish colonial pieces. Proof that these Apache had been raiding Mexican settlements for generations. What they didn't realize was that every item they stole, every bone they disturbed, every sacred object they defiled, was adding weight to the spiritual debt they were accumulating. In Apache justice, some debts could only be paid in blood. Joaquin raised his hand slightly, a signal his family understood. "Not yet, gentlemen." Joaquin's voice remained calm, but those who knew him would have recognized the dangerous undertone. "You're welcome to try filing claims in the mountains. But understand this. Those mountains are protected by more than Apache treaties. They're protected by Apache warriors. And those warriors have friends." And the Vega family had just become the collectors. The alliance forms word traveled through the desert faster than any white man could have imagined. Within a week of the desecration, Apache warriors from 6 different bands had gathered in secret canyons throughout the Dragoon Mountains. These weren't just local fighters. They were veterans of 100 battles. Men who'd fought alongside Cochise and Geronimo. Warriors whose names were whispered in fear from Mexico to Colorado. But this wasn't a traditional Apache war party. Something unprecedented was happening in the desert. Something that would have shocked military commanders across the Southwest if they'd known about it. Alina Vega wasn't just calling for revenge. She was calling for a new kind of warfare. Meeting took place in a hidden canyon, known only to the Apache. A place where ancient petroglyphs covered the walls, like a library of stone. Alina stood before warriors who'd never taken orders from a woman, speaking in the old language, invoking powers that most of them had only heard about in legends. "My grandmother's spirit cannot rest," she began, her voice carrying across the canyon like wind through stone. "The white grave robbers have stolen not just bones, but souls. They've taken sacred objects that were meant to protect our people forever. This crime goes beyond what any one band can answer." War Chief Nate, Coach's son, listened with growing amazement. This woman was speaking like a medicine person, like someone chosen by the spirits themselves. "What do you ask of us?" "I ask for the old justice. Not just death, teaching death. Death that makes other white men afraid to disturb our sacred places ever again." An older warrior named Taza stepped forward. "You speak of the old ways. But you are married to a Mexican. Your children are mixed blood. Why should we spill Apache blood for your family's honor?" Alina pulled out her grandmother's war knife, its obsidian blade gleaming in the firelight. Without hesitation, she drew the edge across her palm, letting blood drip onto the sacred ground. "Because this isn't about my family. This is about our ancestors. This is about stopping the desecration before it spreads to every sacred site in Apache territory. This is about teaching white men that some lines cannot be crossed." She looked around the circle of warriors, meeting each man's eyes. "They burned my grandmother's medicine bundle. They scattered her bones. They're selling sacred objects to white collectors who will put them in glass cases like trophies. If we don't stop this here, if we don't stop it completely, what sacred place will be next?" The silence stretched for several minutes. Finally, Nate spoke. "What kind of justice are you calling for?" Elena's answer would haunt the Arizona territory for decades to come. The kind that makes stories. The kind that gets told around campfires for 100 years. The kind that makes white men wake up screaming. That night, something unprecedented happened in Apache history. Warriors from multiple bands swore a blood oath not just to Alina Vega, but to a new kind of warfare. Psychological warfare designed not just to kill enemies, but to terrorize anyone who might follow in their footsteps. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Joaquin was making preparations of his own. His Mexican contacts had been busy gathering intelligence on Morrison's crew. What they'd learned painted a picture of men who weren't just prospectors, but predators who'd left a trail of violence and stolen property across 3 territories. Morrison himself had outstanding warrants in Texas for cattle rustling and murder. The Harwick brothers were wanted in New Mexico for attacking a Mexican family and burning their farm. Jake Williamson had been run out of Colorado for scalp hunting, taking Apache scalps and selling them to territorial authorities for bounty money. These weren't innocent gold seekers who'd accidentally wandered onto sacred ground. These were professional criminals who'd come to the Dragoon Mountains specifically because they thought the area was too remote and too dangerous for law enforcement to follow them. They were about to learn that some forms of justice didn't require badges or courts. Sophia had been busy with her own preparations. Using her contacts in Tucson and Tombstone, she'd spread carefully crafted stories about the prospectors, stories about their criminal backgrounds, their disrespect for sacred sites, their threats against local families. By the time she was finished, Morrison's crew wouldn't just be fighting Apache warriors and the Vega family. They'd be fighting their own reputation. The alliance that formed in those desert canyons wasn't just between the Vegas and the Apache. It was between everyone who understood that some violations demanded absolute response. Mexican revolutionaries who saw the prospectors as symbols of American expansion, outlaw groups who respected Elena's family connections, even some white settlers who'd been terrorized by Morrison's crew during their journey west. For the first time in territorial history, the desert itself seemed to be taking sides, and Morrison's 16 men were on the wrong side. The tension is building to something incredible. If you're as fascinated by this tale of desert justice as I am, smash that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. What do you think Elena's planning? Because what happens next will go down as one of the most brutal examples of frontier revenge ever recorded. The hunt begins. The Apache don't attack randomly. Every raid, every ambush, every act of warfare follows patterns passed down through generations of desert survival. Elena Vega understood these patterns better than most Apache warriors. Her grandmother had taught her not just the tactics, but the psychology behind them. The hunt for Morrison's crew began not with violence, but with fear. It started with the horses. Apache warriors could move through the desert like ghosts, and they used that ability to wage psychological warfare that would have impressed modern military strategists. Morrison's horses began disappearing one by one, not stolen, but scattered. The prospectors would wake up to find their animals miles away, spooked by sounds they couldn't identify, driven by fears they couldn't understand. Water sources began going bad. Not poisoned, the Apache had too much respect for the desert to actually contaminate water, but fouled in ways that made them undrinkable. Equipment started malfunctioning. Tools disappeared and reappeared in impossible places. Food supplies developed mysterious problems. Morrison's crew began to understand that they weren't just dealing with hostile locals. They were dealing with an enemy that could strike anywhere, anytime, without being seen. "It's like the damn deserts turned against us," complained Tom Bradley, after finding his boots filled with scorpions for the 3rd morning in a row. Morrison tried to maintain discipline, but 17 years of military experience had taught him to recognize when his men were starting to break. The constant harassment, the feeling of being watched, the knowledge that their enemies could reach them anytime they wanted. It was classic guerrilla warfare, executed by masters of the craft. What Morrison didn't know was that Elena had been very specific in her instructions. The psychological campaign wasn't random harassment. It was designed to drive the prospectors toward a specific location, to make them so desperate for defensible ground that they'd abandon their mining operation and retreat to the one place where Elena wanted them: Dead Horse Canyon. The name should have been a warning, but desperate men don't pay attention to warnings. The canyon offered everything Morrison thought his crew needed: high walls for defense, only one entrance to guard, a spring for water, and enough space for 16 men to make a stand. What it really offered was a trap that had been designed by nature and perfected by Elena's planning. The canyon walls weren't just high, they were unclimbable, except at specific points that Elena's people now controlled. The single entrance could be easily blocked. The spring was seasonal and could be diverted, and the defensible space was actually a killing ground where Apache warriors had been practicing ambush techniques for decades. Morrison's retreat to Dead Horse Canyon came on June 3rd, exactly 3 weeks after their first encounter with the Vega family. They'd lost most of their equipment, half their horses, and all of their confidence. What they still had was 16 rifles, plenty of ammunition, and the kind of desperate courage that comes from having nowhere left to run. Alina watched them enter the canyon from a position high on the rim, invisible against the rock face. Beside her, Carlos counted the men and confirmed that all 16 were present. "When do we attack, Mama?" Elena smiled, but it wasn't an expression any child should see on their mother's face. "We don't attack, little ghost. We teach." The lessons began that very night. Apache warfare wasn't about fair fights or honorable combat. It was about survival, about using every advantage the desert provided, about turning the enemy's strengths into weaknesses. Morrison's crew had rifles and military training, but they also had limited water, dwindling food supplies, and no knowledge of the terrain they were trying to defend. The first lesson came from the canyon walls themselves. Apache warriors, moving like shadows in the darkness, began rolling rocks down from the rim. Not large enough to kill, but big enough to injure, to create fear, to make sleep impossible. The sound of falling stones echoed through the canyon all night, a constant reminder that death waited above them. The second lesson was about water. The spring that had drawn Morrison's crew to the canyon suddenly began flowing muddy, then stopped entirely. Elena had spent days learning the underground patterns that fed the spring, and a few strategically placed rocks could control its flow completely. By the fourth day in the canyon, Morrison's men were drinking their own urine and talking about surrender. That's when Elena sent them a message. Sophia approached the canyon entrance alone, carrying a white flag and a bundle wrapped in deerskin. She called out to Morrison in perfect English, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "William Morrison, I come with an offer from Elena Vega." Morrison appeared at the canyon mouth, rifle ready but not aimed. He'd aged a decade in the past week, his confident swagger replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man who'd finally met his match. "What kind of offer?" Sophia unwrapped the bundle, revealing items that made Morrison's blood freeze. Apache scalps from Williamson's belt, personal belongings that had been stolen from the burial sites, and something else, a necklace that Morrison recognized as belonging to Tom Bradley. "My mother offers you the same choice you offered us. Leave now, today, forever, or face the consequences of your actions." Morrison's voice cracked when he answered. "Bradley? Where's Bradley?" Sophia's smile was her mother's daughter through and through. "Tom Bradley learned about Apache justice, the old kind. Would you like to learn too?" That night, the screaming began. The old justice, what happened in Dead Horse Canyon over the next 7 days, would become the stuff of legend and nightmare in equal measure. Elena Vega didn't just want Morrison's crew dead. She wanted their deaths to serve as a warning that would echo across the entire frontier. Apache torture wasn't random cruelty. It was a precise art form designed to extract maximum psychological impact from minimum resources. Elena had learned these techniques not from warriors but from her grandmother, who'd been a master at using fear as a weapon more powerful than any rifle. The Apache believed that how a man died determined how his spirit would exist in the afterlife. A warrior who died bravely in battle would find honor in the spirit world. A coward who begged for mercy would carry that shame forever. But someone who died as punishment for violating sacred law, that person's spirit would never find rest. Tom Bradley had been chosen as the first lesson because his hatred for non-whites had made him especially vocal about the crew's plans to sell Apache artifacts. His death was designed to be heard by the other 15 men trapped in the canyon. A preview of what awaited anyone who thought they could desecrate sacred ground without consequences. The screaming lasted for hours. When it finally stopped, Sophia returned to the canyon entrance with another bundle. This time she didn't call for Morrison. She simply left the package where the prospectors could find it, and melted back into the desert darkness. Inside the bundle, Morrison's crew found pieces of Tom Bradley. Not enough to bury, but enough to understand exactly what had happened to him. They also found a message written in Bradley's blood on a piece of his own shirt. 15 to go. That's when Morrison finally understood the kind of enemy he was facing. This wasn't about territory, or gold, or even revenge for insults. This was about spiritual justice administered by people who viewed scalping as a mercy compared to what they were planning for grave robbers. Jake Williamson tried to run that night. He'd been a buffalo hunter and an Apache scalp taker, and he knew something about frontier violence. But he'd never encountered anything like what Elena Vega had unleashed in Dead Horse Canyon. The Apache caught him before he'd made it 100 yards from the canyon mouth. His screams joined the night wind, and by morning there was another bundle waiting for Morrison's crew. Preacher Collins tried negotiating, shouting Bible verses and promises of repentance into the desert air. His theological arguments were answered by war cries that seemed to come from the canyon walls themselves. When Collins' screaming finally stopped, the sounds were replaced by something worse. Apache war chants sung in voices that seemed to belong to the dead. The Harwick brothers tried to fight. They'd built a reputation for violence across 3 territories, and they weren't going to die like sheep in a slaughter pen. Their last stand lasted almost 6 hours, a running battle through the canyon that ended only when Apache arrows found their mark. But even their deaths weren't quick. Elena wanted every man in that canyon to understand that there were fates worse than dying in battle. By the end of the first week, Morrison had 7 men left. 7 men who hadn't slept in days, who jumped at every shadow, who'd watched their companions disappear one by one into a nightmare that seemed to have no end. That's when Elena decided it was time for the final lesson. She appeared at the canyon entrance herself, alone, unarmed except for her grandmother's war knife. In the blazing desert sun, she looked like something out of Apache legend, a woman warrior come to collect debts owed to the spirit world. William Morrison. Her voice echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. You came to my family's land with threats. You desecrated sacred ground. You stole from the dead. Now, you will pay the price. Morrison stumbled out from behind his makeshift fortification, his rifle shaking in his hands. The confident cavalry officer who'd ridden up to the Vega ranch was gone, replaced by a broken man who'd seen too much death to remember what courage looked like. Please, he whispered. We didn't know. We'll leave. We'll never come back. A laugh echoed off the stone walls like the sound of winter wind through dead trees. You did know. Williamson knew what Apache scalps looked like. Collins knew what sacred bundles were for. Bradley knew the difference between a grave and a mining site. You all knew, and you chose to violate sacred law anyway. She raised her grandmother's war knife, its obsidian blade catching the desert sun like black fire. Now you'll know what sacred justice looks like. What happened next would be whispered around campfires for generations. A story so brutal that even hardened frontier veterans would cross themselves when they heard it. Elena Vega didn't just kill Morrison's remaining crew, she transformed their deaths into a message that would travel across the entire Southwest. The Apache had returned to the old ways, and the old ways remembered every insult, every violation, every drop of blood that had been spilled on sacred ground. We're approaching the climax of this incredible story, but I need you to understand, what I'm about to tell you next is so intense, so brutal, that it changed how people viewed frontier justice forever. Hit that like button if you're ready for the shocking conclusion, and let me know in the comments, do you think Elena went too far? Or was this exactly the justice that Morrison's crew deserved? The skinning what Elena Vega did to Morrison's remaining 7 men in Dead Horse Canyon became the most feared story in Apache oral tradition and the most suppressed incident in territorial records. Military commanders buried the reports. Newspapers refused to print the details. Even Apache warriors who'd participated in the event rarely spoke of it. And when they did, it was in whispers. The skinning wasn't random butchery. It was a precise ritual designed to ensure that the spirits of the grave robbers would never find peace in any world, living or dead. Elena began with Morrison himself. The former Confederate officer, who'd ridden onto Vega land with such arrogance, was stripped, naked and staked to the canyon floor, in a position that mimicked the burial postures his crew had disturbed. His arms were spread to match the sacred directions, his body aligned with the path of the sun across the sky. The Apache believed that skin was the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. By removing it slowly, carefully, in patterns that matched the sacred tattoos worn by their ancestors, Elena was ensuring that Morrison's spirit would be trapped between worlds forever, too damaged for the afterlife, too violated for the living world. The process took 3 days. Morrison's screams echoed off the canyon walls for the first day, growing weaker as the desert sun and Elena's knife did their work. By the second day, his voice was gone, replaced by sounds that didn't seem entirely human. On the third day, there was only silence broken by the sound of wind through exposed bone. But Elena wasn't finished with Morrison. When his body finally died, she began the spiritual component of his punishment. Using techniques her grandmother had taught her for dealing with evil spirits, she performed rituals designed to bind Morrison's soul to the violated burial ground, making him an eternal guardian of the sacred sites he'd desecrated. The remaining 6 men watched every moment, They were staked in a circle around Morrison, forced to witness what awaited them, unable to look away or even close their eyes for long periods. Alina had learned from her grandmother that anticipation was often worse than actual torture, and she wanted these men to experience both. The second man chosen was Jake Williamson, the scalp hunter. Elena's treatment of him was particularly elaborate, designed to match the crimes he'd committed against Apache families across the Southwest. For every scalp he'd taken, she made a corresponding cut. For every Apache child who'd been orphaned by his actions, she inflicted a matching wound. Williamson lasted for days. Preacher Collins received special attention because of his role in burning sacred objects. Alina used fire as part of his death, not to kill him quickly, but to purify him slowly, burning away the spiritual contamination he'd accumulated through his violations of sacred law. His death lasted 5 days, during which his screams turned into what sounded almost like prayers, not to the Christian God he'd once served, but to Apache spirits he'd spent his life denying. The Harwick brothers, who'd made their reputation through brutality against Mexican and Apache families, died together as they'd lived together. Alina staked them, facing each other, their bodies positioned so that each brother's death would be the last thing the other saw. Their punishment lasted a full week, during which they experienced every form of torture they'd inflicted on others over their violent careers. By the time Alina reached the final 2 men, prospectors who'd joined Morrison's crew more for desperation than hatred, something had changed in Dead Horse Canyon. The very air seemed thick with spiritual presence, as if the spirits of violated ancestors had gathered to witness justice being done. These last 2 men, William Torres and Samuel Creek, received what might be called mercy by Apache standards. Their deaths were quicker, designed more to complete the spiritual cleansing of the canyon than to punish individual crimes. But even their merciful deaths lasted 2 days each, and their screams added to the chorus of voices that now seemed to haunt the canyon walls. When it was over, Alina had spent 3 weeks transforming 16 living men into a message that would echo across the entire frontier. The bodies were arranged in patterns that told the story of their crimes. Grave robbers positioned to mirror the burials they'd violated. Scalp hunters displayed to match the trophies they'd taken. Sacred ground desecrators spread across the earth they'd contaminated. But the physical arrangement was only part of Elena's message. The spiritual component was far more complex. Using rituals her grandmother had taught her, Elena bound the souls of all 16 men to Dead Horse Canyon, making them eternal guardians of Apache sacred sites. According to Apache belief, their spirits would spend eternity experiencing the fear and pain they'd inflicted on others, while simultaneously serving as warnings to anyone else who might consider violating sacred ground. The skinned bodies were left as they'd died, exposed to the desert sun and the desert wind. Within days, the canyon had become a place of such spiritual power that even Apache warriors approached it with caution. The very rocks seemed to whisper with the voices of the dead, telling their story to anyone brave enough to listen. When territorial authorities finally discovered Dead Horse Canyon, 6 months later, they found 16 skeletons arranged in patterns they couldn't understand, surrounded by evidence of mining equipment and grave robbing that told a story no official report would ever include. The case was officially closed as death by hostile Apache action, a designation that ignored the complexity of what had actually happened, but preserved the fiction that territorial law had some meaning in the desert. Alina Vega had achieved something unprecedented in frontier history. She'd created a legend so powerful that it changed behavior across the entire Southwest. For decades afterward, prospectors avoided Apache burial grounds, not because of legal consequences, but because of stories about Dead Horse Canyon and the fate that awaited anyone who disturbed sacred ground. The skinning had become more than revenge. It had become a form of spiritual terrorism that protected Apache sacred sites more effectively than any treaty or military patrol. The legend lives. News of Dead Horse Canyon spread through the Southwest like wildfire, carried by Apache messengers, Mexican traders, and the few white witnesses brave enough to visit the site. But the story that traveled wasn't just about 16 dead prospectors. It was about the power of spiritual justice and the price of violating sacred law. Alina Vega's name became synonymous with a new kind of frontier legend. She wasn't just another Apache warrior or another mixed-blood survivor trying to navigate between worlds. She'd become something entirely new, a bridge between ancient justice and modern warfare. Someone who could invoke the old powers to solve contemporary problems. Apache bands across the Southwest began seeking her advice on dealing with white encroachment. Mexican revolutionaries wanted her help planning raids against American settlements. Even some white outlaw groups approached her family, hoping to learn the psychological warfare techniques that had destroyed Morrison's crew so completely. But Alina had accomplished her primary goal. Sacred sites throughout the Dragoon Mountains and far beyond were left untouched by prospectors and grave robbers. The story of Dead Horse Canyon became so powerful that even mentioning Apache burial grounds was enough to make hardened miners change direction. Joaquin found his wife, changed by the events in the canyon. The gentle woman who'd raised their children had been replaced by someone harder, someone who carried the weight of 16 deaths and the responsibility for protecting an entire culture's sacred places. She still loved her family, still participated in daily ranch life, but part of her now belonged to the desert and the spirits that moved through it. Miguel had participated in the final stages of his mother's justice, and the experience had marked him in ways that would influence the rest of his life. He'd learned that violence could be more than just conflict. It could be art, ritual, spiritual practice. He'd also learned that some lines, once crossed, changed you forever. Sophia had served as messenger and psychological warfare specialist, using her intelligence and linguistic skills to spread carefully crafted versions of the Dead Horse Canyon story. Her ability to navigate between cultures made her invaluable in shaping how the legend was understood by different audiences. Even young Carlos had been transformed by the experience. His natural ability to move unseen through the desert had been refined into something almost supernatural during the 3 weeks of hunting Morrison's crew. Apache warriors began calling him Ghostwalker not as a nickname, but as a formal recognition of abilities that seemed to transcend normal human limitations. The Vega family had become more than ranchers trying to survive on the frontier. They'd become the guardians of a new form of justice, protectors of sacred ground, and living bridges between the ancient world and the modern one. But legends come with prices, and the price of Dead Horse Canyon was isolation. White settlers feared the family now, seeing them as representatives of savage justice rather than potential neighbors. Mexican authorities viewed them with suspicion, understanding that Elena's actions had challenged governmental authority in ways that could spread to other resistance movements. Even some Apache began keeping their distance, recognizing that Elena had accessed powers that were meant to be used sparingly, if at all. The rituals she'd performed in Dead Horse Canyon had been necessary, but they'd also been spiritually dangerous, the kinds of ceremonies that could consume those who practiced them. The family adapted to their new reality by deepening their connections to the desert itself. They became experts not just at survival, but at the kind of warfare that used landscape, weather, and spiritual belief as weapons more powerful than rifles or cavalry charges. Their ranch became a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand the old ways of justice. Apache war leaders would travel hundreds of miles to consult with Alina about strategy and spiritual preparation for battle. Mexican revolutionaries sought her advice on psychological warfare techniques. Even some white outlaws, those who'd gained respect for Apache fighting methods, would approach the family for guidance. But Elena's most important legacy wasn't the fear she'd instilled in grave robbers or the respect she'd earned from warriors. It was the precedent she'd established. The idea that some violations of sacred law demanded absolute response, regardless of the consequences. Dead Horse Canyon became a place of pilgrimage and warning, where Apache families would bring their children to learn about the price of defending sacred ground. The canyon walls still echoed with whispers of the 16 men who'd died there, their spirits bound to eternal guardianship of the places they'd violated in life. Years later, when Geronimo was planning his final resistance against the U.S. military, he would send messengers to Elena Vega, seeking her advice on how to make the American government understand that some fights weren't about territory or politics, but about spiritual survival. Her answer would help shape the last great Apache war, and her methods would influence Native American resistance movements for generations to come. The skinning of Morrison's crew hadn't just been revenge. It had been a declaration that indigenous justice still existed, still had power, and still demanded respect from anyone who thought they could violate sacred law without consequences. This incredible story is coming to its conclusion, but the impact of Elena Vega's actions echoed through American history for decades. Before we wrap up this amazing tale, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one reveal truths about the American frontier that most history books won't tell you. Drop a comment and let me know. What do you think about Elena's methods? Was this justice, or was this something else entirely? The reckoning spreads. The legend of Dead Horse Canyon didn't stay contained in the Arizona territory. Within 6 months, Variations of Elena Vega's story were being told around campfires from Colorado to California, each version adding details that made the tale even more terrifying to those who might consider violating Native American sacred sites. The U.S. military took notice when recruitment for desert patrols suddenly became impossible. Soldiers who'd been willing to fight Apache warriors in open combat refused assignments that might take them near burial grounds or sacred sites. The psychological impact of Elena's actions had created a form of spiritual warfare that was more effective than traditional military resistance. General George Crook, known for his experience fighting Apache bands, filed classified reports about the Dead Horse Canyon incident that revealed how completely Elena had changed the nature of frontier conflict. Traditional military tactics assumed that indigenous resistance was primarily about territory and resources. Elena had demonstrated that some conflicts were about worldviews, about fundamental differences in how different cultures understood justice, death, and the relationship between the living and the dead. Mexican authorities faced similar problems. Grave robbing had been a lucrative sideline for many prospectors working both sides of the border. But Elena's methods had made the practice so feared that artifact smuggling dropped by over 80% in the year following Dead Horse Canyon. The economic impact was significant, but the psychological impact was revolutionary. Elena herself seemed to understand the broader implications of what she'd accomplished. In the months following the skinning, she began reaching out to other indigenous groups throughout the Southwest, sharing not just the tactical details of her psychological warfare, but the spiritual principles that had made it so effective. Pueblo leaders traveled hundreds of miles to consult with her about protecting their own sacred sites. Navajo medicine men sought her advice on dealing with white encroachment on ceremonial grounds. Even Comanche war chiefs, traditional enemies of the Apache, sent emissaries to learn about her methods. What emerged was something unprecedented in Native American history, a pan-tribal approach to spiritual warfare that transcended traditional tribal boundaries and unified indigenous resistance around shared concepts of sacred ground and ancestral protection. Elena's influence reached beyond Native American communities. Mexican revolutionary groups began adopting her psychological warfare techniques for use against American territorial expansion. The idea that extreme violence, carefully orchestrated and spiritually justified, could change behavior across entire populations became a cornerstone of resistance movements throughout the borderlands. Even some white communities began to understand that Elena had accomplished something that military campaigns and treaty negotiations had failed to achieve. She'd created genuine respect for indigenous sacred sites, not through legal mechanisms, but through the kind of fear that changes fundamental behavior. The Vega family's ranch became an informal embassy where different cultures could negotiate, not just practical agreements, but spiritual understandings. Joaquin's linguistic skills and Elena's growing reputation as a spiritual warrior made them uniquely qualified to serve as intermediaries in conflicts that traditional diplomacy couldn't address. But the family paid a personal price for their legendary status. They could never again live as simple ranchers trying to survive on the frontier. Every decision they made, every action they took, was viewed through the lens of Dead Horse Canyon. They'd become symbols of indigenous resistance, and symbols don't get to choose their own meanings. Miguel struggled with the expectations placed on him as Elena's son. Apache warriors expected him to demonstrate the same ruthless commitment to spiritual justice that his mother had shown. Mexican revolutionaries wanted him to lead raids against American settlements. White authorities viewed him as a potential threat who needed to be monitored constantly. Sophia found her intelligence and linguistic skills in constant demand from groups seeking to understand and adapt. Elena's methods, she became, in effect, the historian and theologian of a new form of warfare. Someone who could explain the spiritual principles behind the psychological tactics. Carlos, now 15 and fully grown into his nickname Ghostwalker, had become a legend in his own right. Apache bands competed to have him serve as scout and psychological warfare specialist. His ability to move unseen and strike without warning had been refined through years of practice into something that seemed almost supernatural. The family had achieved something unprecedented in frontier history. They'd forced American territorial expansion to acknowledge indigenous spiritual authority. But they'd also discovered that legends are prisons as much as they are sources of power. Elena herself seemed to understand this better than anyone. In the years following Dead Horse Canyon, she began working not just as a warrior, but as a teacher. passing on the spiritual and tactical knowledge that had made her methods so effective. She understood that the real victory wasn't the destruction of Morrison's crew, but the creation of a new form of indigenous resistance that could survive even after she was gone. The skinning had been just the beginning. The real legacy of Dead Horse Canyon was the idea that indigenous justice could still compel respect in a world increasingly dominated by white authority. Elena Vega had proven that some powers couldn't be conquered. Only accommodated. And accommodation, she had learned, was just another word for victory. Epilogue. Ghosts in the desert today. More than 140 years after Elena Vega skinned 16 prospectors in Dead Horse Canyon, the site remains one of the most spiritually powerful places in the American Southwest. Apache families still bring their children there to learn about the price of defending sacred ground. Archaeologists avoid the area, not because of legal restrictions, but because of stories that have been passed down through generations of desert dwellers. The Vega family's legacy extends far beyond a single act of revenge. Elena's methods influenced Native American resistance movements well into the 20th century. Her psychological warfare techniques were studied by military strategists during World War II. Her spiritual approach to conflict resolution became a model for indigenous rights movements worldwide. But perhaps the most important legacy of Dead Horse Canyon is what it taught about the power of stories themselves. Elena Vega understood that brutal justice, carefully orchestrated and powerfully narrated, could create legends that changed behavior more effectively than any law or military campaign. The 16 prospectors who rode into the Dragoon Mountains, looking for gold, became something they never intended to be. Teachers whose deaths educated generations of people about the consequences of violating sacred ground. Their skinned bodies became textbooks in spiritual warfare. Their screams became warnings that echoed across the entire frontier. Elena herself died in 1923, at the age of 89, surrounded by grandchildren who carried her blood and great-grandchildren who carried her stories. She'd lived to see the Apache Wars end, the frontier close, and the American West transform into something unrecognizable from the violent borderland where she'd made her name. But she'd also lived to see indigenous sacred sites protected not by treaty or law, but by the kind of fear that transcends generations. The story of Dead Horse Canyon had become more powerful than any legal document, more effective than any military patrol. Joaquin had died 15 years earlier, still proud of the woman who'd chosen spiritual warfare over surrender, still convinced that his wife had found the only response adequate to the violation of sacred ground. Their children and grandchildren carried forward not just the family name, but the understanding that some principles are worth any price. Miguel became a leader in the early Native American rights movement, using his mother's reputation and his own skills to negotiate protections for sacred sites throughout the Southwest. He never again participated in the kind of extreme violence that had marked his youth. But he never apologized for it either. Sophia used her intelligence and linguistic abilities to become one of the first Native American women to document indigenous history from an indigenous perspective. Her writings about Dead Horse Canyon became the authoritative account of events that military historians either ignored or deliberately suppressed. Carlos the Ghost Walker disappeared into the desert in 1891 and was never seen again by white authorities. Apache oral tradition suggests that he became something more than human, a spiritual guardian who continued his mother's work of protecting sacred sites through methods that transcended ordinary warfare. The ranch in the Dragoon Mountains passed through several generations of Vega descendants before finally being donated to the Apache Nation in 1976. It's now part of a cultural preservation area where traditional ceremonies are still performed and traditional stories are still told. Dead Horse Canyon itself remains largely unchanged from Elena's time. The walls still echo with sounds that visitors can't quite identify. The rocks still whisper with voices that seem to come from somewhere beyond the physical world. And occasionally, people report seeing figures moving through the canyon, 16 men walking in formation, forever guarding the sacred ground they violated in life. Modern forensic anthropologists who've studied the site confirm that the arrangement of skeletal remains follows patterns consistent with Apache spiritual practices, suggesting that Elena's work had indeed been more than simple revenge. It had been a complex religious ceremony designed to bind spirits to eternal service. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Dead Horse Canyon legacy is how it continues to influence behavior today. Mining companies still avoid Apache burial grounds. not because of federal regulations, but because of corporate policies influenced by stories about spiritual consequences. Archaeological expeditions still include spiritual consultants from local tribes.